Good evening. Good evening and welcome. This is the sixth session of Plato and Deleuze, Free University of Brighton philosophy course. For those of you who are part of the Free University of Brighton, there will be a seminar at 8 o'clock on Zoom rather, and the details are on River. I've just put them in the recent chat there. If you're not on River, if you're not a member of the Free University of Brighton and you want to do any follow-up on the course, you want to ask questions or anything, then you're welcome to do so on a Discord, which is linked on my Twitch page. So that's a bit of housekeeping out of the way. So this week we're going to be delving a little bit more into the relationship that Deleuze has explicitly with Plato. And it's primarily through this word, the simulacra, that we're going to be encountering in a bit more detail the way in which Deleuze kind of reads Plato and the way in which he carries out a project he calls reversal, the reversal of Platonism, not the rejection, the reversal. That's what it's referred to in the logic of sense, and that was what people were reading for today, one of the appendices for the logic of sense. And if you've been reading that's some of what I'll be talking about today. This is the appendix, the Simulacrum and Ancient Philosophy. If you're interested, for next week we're going to be reading the second part of that on Lucretius. But I'll be referring a little bit to that section from the Logic of Sense today, or at least I'll be referring kind of with it in the background. I won't necessarily be doing a lot of page numbers. So let's get going. One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit this week at the start, because we're going to try and do some of this in the seminar, and I want to try and do a little bit more of this over the next few weeks, is notions of diagrams. And this came from talking with someone who was in the class last week, and the difficulty of grasping some of the kind of sort of fluid and like multifarious concepts that are at work here, and the way in which different people have different kind of ways of dealing with ideas and concepts and forms and all this kind of strange philosophical sort of discussion of their relationships and their various interrelationships, and that the diagrams are useful for a lot of people. And actually, I really like diagrams. I have a big interest in the way in which diagrams kind of operate, and as did Deleuze, as it happens. So I mean, and there's been some work on this in this secondary literature, as we call it. In other words, not by work that other philosophers have written about Deleuze, and some of them are focused on the role of diagrams, if you want to look that up. Anyway, just to bring that up a little bit bigger for you. So just in terms of what a diagram is, here's just some elements. I mean, this is not exhaustive at all, but when I'm talking about simulacra, is there a plural for... Yes, the plural for simulacra is simulacrum, I think, but maybe not. We'll look at that. I don't know. Anyway, so just some notes on what I think of it as a diagram, and the way in which you might yourself be able to pick them up is diagrams are basically ways of putting together terms and connections, but they have three parts, I think, more than two. They have dynamics that you're trying to diagram, so directions of production or determination, directions of inclusion and exclusion, so directions in which something makes something else happen, sort of thing. Or make something else, not happen, perhaps. They have parts, what we might think of as elements, and these parts can be simple, they could be complex. They can be parts that have kind of input-output structures, so something goes in, something comes out, and there can be a degree of transformation in those input-outputs. So something goes in looking black and it comes out looking white, something goes in as a tree and it comes out as lumber. I mean, those are kind of, dynamics of input-output transformations. And so parts can be simple or complex, and they can have these kind of input-output relations. And there are obviously also connections, which are generally speaking relations. Relations can be kind of internal, external, temporal, spatial. You can make up all of your own different bits of a diagram if you want. The idea was, and I've made up a couple that I'll be using in as part of this lecture, and hopefully we might be able to talk a little bit about it in seminars. But the idea is as a kind of exercise, if you're following the course and you're doing some of the reading, is if you want to kind of explore doing diagrams yourself, just begin to draw some, make them up, make them up, obviously not just from completely left field, make them up from the terms and from some of the possible connections that you think might be there, and then sort of test them out. Look at other things I've said, other things other people have said, look at the texts themselves, the Plato and the Deleuze, and see whether it kind of works. So yeah, that's what I want you to do, is just mention this notion of diagrams and encourage people to maybe think about doing some themselves. Anyway, hopefully that's kind of makes sense. Right. So I want to talk a little bit more at the start of this lecture about ideas. Again, that's kind of, we're talking a lot about ideas, and it's not always the easiest thing to get our head around. And obviously the reason we're talking about ideas again is because we're talking about Plato. We're talking about the theory of ideas, sometimes called the theory of forms, and we're talking about this theory of ideas as central to Plato. It's, if not his theory, there may be ambiguity around that. If it's not, even if it's not his theory, it's definitely one of the primary objects or one of the primary theories of discussion within Plato's dialogues. And so it has a kind of key role, even if we didn't want to necessarily ascribe it to Plato himself. It has a kind of key role at the centre of an ongoing set of discussions and dialogues that he has. Aside from obviously being central to Plato, I'm just going to enjoy my tea. Aside from obviously being central to Plato, what the theory of ideas does, one of its effects that we need to kind of pay attention to, is that it institutes something we might call an ontological break. It breaks a relationship between us and the objects around us, us and the world around us, us and what we think exists in the world, which is why we might think of it as a little bit like it's kind of instituting a kind of ontological break. It brings us up short. It breaks us from our previous way of thinking about the world and about objects. This is how it plays out in the dialogues. This is kind of its role, is to do this, to make this kind of break, in thinking you know what's going on in the world, the break that prompts you to examine your life and all this other kind of stuff that's all caught up with Plato and Socrates. And when it does this, it kind of produces in our ontology, in our kind of theory of things in the world, the kind of the way the world is, it kind of produces a break in that theory itself, as well as this kind of break point in our experience. And it produces a break between essence and appearance. I mean, that's what I'm putting at here. And so the theory of ideas is kind of central to Plato, and central to that is this kind of ontological break between essence and appearance. So we might say it's something like it breaks reality, in that it denies the immediate as a ground of experience. So in other words, what's experienced in the appearances of objects that when we encounter them in the world, and that, when I'm talking about objects, I mean just stuff, things, anything. That can include people, it can include tables, it can include chairs, it can include abstract objects like money or the economy or the university or something. But what is experienced when we encounter those objects is something sort of in the appearance, and this is the essence, the real. So the object is temporal, it's transitory, it changes depending upon the lighting it might have, upon which time of day you might be encountering it, or upon which, it changes. Whereas the essence is eternal, it's kind of outside of time. So what we encounter in the appearance, which is in time, is something that's kind of beyond time. So the appearance is kind of giving us away to something else, but these things have got quite a radical distinction between them. So the appearance is giving us away to the essence, but in terms of something quite fundamental like time, the appearance is in time, the essence is atemporal, outside of time. So there's quite a strong distinction between these, and it's the essence where reality is encountered. So appearances are means to access what we might call the real, even the real essence of the thing, and their means are used by the intellect. So they're not the means that we encounter in our everyday sensory encounter with the world and appearances. They're not the 5 sensations, 5 touch, 5 not touch. It's five senses. Yeah, five sensations. I got myself confused. It's not the five senses. It's not touch and sight and all that kind of stuff. It's through the intellect that they become this kind of means through which we can get to their reality, their essences. So in some sense, I mean, I'm going to hesitate here because this is hostage to fortune. But in some sense, we might think of appearances as something like doorways. You know, they're kind of empty spaces in some sense that constrain rather than have content in themselves. So the appearance kind of points us towards, gives us a way through towards the essence itself. And this picture of ideas is, you know, like a portal. Yeah, like a portal. So the appearances are kind of, you know, there are portals to the atemporal. They're ways of encountering the transcendent. They're ways of encountering the real things in this different world. So yeah, I mean, and when we think of the analogy of the cave, obviously there's kind of doorways and things in there. As I say, it's a kind of hostage to fortune. There's bound to be something terribly wrong with the idea of that somewhere that, you know, once we pursue it, actually turns on us and bites us in the back side. But for now, it's a workable idea, I think. So think of that as kind of a key change that takes place with Plato. So there's some situation before that Plato's work, Plato's dialogues are showing is kind of being reorganized, as I was saying last week. And it's being reorganized into this sort of situation where essence and appearance have kind of produced a kind of break in the real. So appearance is no longer real for us. And this is why I've got this line up here. Just bring it up for you again. The real is the idea accessed by the intellect through the modes of the object. The modes of the object are both its different appearances, say during the day, or, you know, to different people, but also different instances of the object, different instances of the idea. So different tables for the idea of the table, different instances of just person for the idea of justice. So as I say, that's the real is the idea accessed by the intellect through the sort of modes of appearance, the ways in which things appear. So let's have some examples of that. The righteous. The righteous person is the person with justice on their side. We might encounter various people who claim kind of righteousness. So these are the appearances, the various people claiming to be righteous. They might all have different ways in which they sort of think that righteousness appears. Obviously, it seems righteous people often think they kind of often embody the way in which righteousness appears. But let's not be too cynical. Let's just assume that there might be lots of different ways in which we kind of see righteousness appear. And so we're accessing the idea of righteousness and justice by kind of going through and looking at the various different appearances and applying the dialectic of division and collection to the various appearances. We're sorting out the various different claims, we're making types, we're kind of splitting and dividing, and then we're collecting. We're working through the different appearances, sorting out the different appearances. When we think again of the table, the perennial bloody object that we go to as philosophers, probably because we spend so much time at a kind of table or a desk, and you can't help but kind of think about them a lot, I suppose, sometimes anyway. So the table is another example. The table, we might say, is the object that is used as a surface. Now, we know immediately with that definition that when we begin to kind of collect and divide different things that are used as surfaces, some of them are going to be tables and some are not going to be tables. And so we're going to be using a definition to collect, and then we're going to divide as to who sort of sorts themselves rightly into that, and we know is also a table, and who doesn't. And then we might be able to refine our definition beyond just an object that's used as a surface. So one of the things we're doing with an idea or a form or a model, as Deleuze sometimes refers to it in Logic of Sense in that particular piece we're reading, is we're forming when we encounter the appearances, we're forming a better grasp of the idea of the table as a result of clarifying what we exclude and what we include. And this is the idea of the dialect. This is the way in which the intellect kind of accesses essence. It's not like any. I mean, this is one of the difficulties with the portal door kind of analogy or image. Is it's not like an immediate access to the idea. This is a kind of ongoing process. So if we go through the door, then it's a kind of set of steps, that we need to go up. So it's a bloody long tower that we have to climb through the door. So even if it's a portal, it's another bloody long tower. So there's a lot of work to be done, doing the dialectic in order to get towards the essence. But that's the kind of general dynamic from the appearances to the essences, through this process of collection and sorting. And putting into groups and things like this. So this is the idea again, Platonic ideas. So let's move to some of these diagrams that I was talking about at the start. I'll bring that up for you. So let's see what we've got here. So this relationship is the kind of primary relationship that we find in Plato. This relationship between an original and a copy through participation. So the copy somehow participates in the original, but that's what's giving it. And it's the original that is the source here. It's the foundation, the ground, the source. The appearances come, as it were, afterwards, although that's probably that involves a kind of temporal problematic. And if we're talking about essences being outside of time, then the afterwards is kind of problematic. But there's the relation of determination in which the original is primary and the copy is secondary. But one of the things that Deleuze wants to talk about. Let me just come back a second. Whoa. There we are. Hang on. One of the things that Deleuze wants to talk about with the simulacrum is this example on the right, this diagram on the right. So what I've got here is the idea and two different kinds of relationship, between objects and ideas. So this relationship here, the relationship of participation, is such that the object is a copy. But there's another kind of relationship, the relationship of the simulacrum, and the relationship in which the object is the simulacrum, and not a copy of the idea, but a simulacrum of the idea. And so these kind of two relationships, one in which the object is a copy of the idea and the other in which the object is a simulacrum of the idea, these kind of show what it is that what's to be selected out. So for Plato, what's to be selected out is everything on the right side, this red relationship here. We're to try and select out the relationships of the simulacrum, although, the false pretenders. And we're to select in the right pretenders, the right claimants. And so whilst there's one primary relationship, there's a way in which that relationship, we might say, is got right or got wrong. And that's what we're doing in part through the dialectic, is we're sorting out between right claimants and false pretenders. We're sorting out the right kind of relationship and the wrong kind of relationship. Now that's where you can kind of perhaps get a hint of where the difficulty lies, because we're not sorting out a kind of simple truth statement, something's like kind of factual description. And so that we can kind of check against the world. Remember, the world itself is a world of appearances. We can't check something in the world. We can't check something in the world of appearances to check whether that particular appearance is in some sense the right kind of claim to the essence that it claims to be an appearance of. Okay, yes, we can. Let's keep going with that a little bit. I'm going to try the next diagram. As I say, just draw some diagrams, play around with them, see what they do, see whether they can work for you. These are sort of fairly minimal diagrams. Let's try another one. So division and collection again. Let's try this one. So I've kind of complicated things a little bit. So we can see that we've got the same kind of elements. We've got idea and object, as we did before, and we've also got relations. Instead of splitting it into a left and a right, this time I've split it into version 1 and version 2. Because this time, this is more what Deleuze is saying at this point. The previous diagram, let's just see, I should be able to go, oh no, that's the wrong way, let's go that way. So the previous diagram, this is kind of Plato apart from the word simulacra. So apart from this word, which we might dispute, the rest of it is fairly straightforward in a sense, except we might also change this word object here. It's difficult to be precise perhaps, but basically there is a process in Plato of participation, right participation, wrong participation, and what Deleuze is kind of saying is that process of wrong participation, he's going to name the simulacra as kind of identified in that process, and then he's going to try and re-describe what's going on in the dialectic himself a little bit using something like this kind of diagram. So in this second diagram, again, as I say, we've got this, take version 1, we've got the idea, we've got a kind of relationship to an object, and a relationship that we're going to describe as resemblance. The relationship is one in which the idea is primary, and there's a relationship in which the object is a copy of the idea. So the idea is the source for the copy that is the object. And then there's also a relationship of knowledge that's given in the dialectic, in which we go from the object back to the idea through the intellect and the use of dialectic. So that this is a description, version 1, this is a description perhaps from Deleuze's perspective of how Plato is working. Although, roughly how Plato is working, there are lots of complications. And this version 2 is more of a description by Deleuze of how the process actually is taking place. Now, there's two different things going on here. When I say when this is a description by Deleuze of what's actually taking place, we'll distinguish between what's taking place in Plato and what's taking place in the world. And so for now, let's just not worry too much about whether these are right or wrong in some sense. Let's just understand that these are kind of the ways in which Deleuze is rereading Plato, perhaps against his own intentions. And he has this habit of doing this with philosophers, so this is not out of the blue. He calls it approaching them from behind and giving birth to an immaculate child, a kind of, one that kind of comes out of some strange kind of connection between him as a thinker and this other philosopher. So I think it's more likely that this kind of second thing is best described as Plato's reading of Deleuze rather than Deleuze's reading of Plato, rather than Deleuze's reading of the world itself. And in that, what he argues is the relationship is not actually one of resemblance, this relationship between objects and ideas, but it's in fact a relationship of difference or disparity. And whilst it does begin in a sense, particularly the knowledge relationship, kind of with a movement from the object towards the idea, it never reaches an idea, it's constantly coming back to the object. And so in a sense, the idea becomes a kind of horizon or something glimpsed in a dynamic of movement from the object to something like the group or the collection or the general form that we might call the essence or the idea. But there is no essence or idea that we can actually reach. There's just this kind of set of features, perhaps. But that set of features is kind of organised not as a definition, but as a kind of set of features that have something like a connection with each other, but through their own difference. This is where it becomes kind of complicated. The important thing to remember is that in this situation, we have a relationship called resemblance. In this situation, we have a relationship of disparity or difference. That's the important thing to remember just for now. I'll leave that up just for a moment when we continue on this. Now, given that we've got these two possible relationships between resemblance and the relationship of difference, and it might need us to clarify what we mean by that relationship of difference, that's fine. But given that we've got two relationships, we can ask, should our process of dialectic, should our process of division and collection operate by means of resemblance or disparity? Which should we be kind of using here when we're kind of collecting things together and splitting things apart? Now, this is only going to make sense in some ways when going through some of the processes of division and collection. So this is one of the reasons why there's some strange stuff in the sophist that looks quite boring, but it's worth going through some of the ways in which the processes of division and collection take place there with this question in mind. Are they using resemblances or are they using differences to make the distinctions that they're making? Now, one of the things that's also crucial in this kind of situation is that there aren't all of this stuff in a particular set of relationships of a diagram is given together. There is not an idea that somehow sits outside and then an object that somehow sits outside. In the particular relationships that we put them in with these middle points, we kind of change what we think of as an idea as well as changing what we think of as an object. And so that's also kind of difficult because each point in our relationships that we set up in diagram co-determine other points. And the way in which we want to think about this is what we're looking at in a diagram is the relationship itself. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at elements particularly. We're kind of, what we're trying to do is trying to map the relationship itself. And the bits at the end, the elements kind of become what they are given the kind of relationship. And so there can be, productive, healthy relationships. There can be, paranoid relationships. There can be unproductive, destructive relationships. I mean, there are kind of types of relationships, and that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. It needs to be thought of, and those diagrams need to be thought of as relationships, without us focusing too much and getting too sort of hooked on elements somehow pre-existing those relationships. Obviously, there were, elements in some sense pre-existed relationships, but the relationships have changed them, just as anyone who's a human being in a human relationship knows that relationships are going to change, the dynamics, the people, the elements that are in there. And similarly with relationships between animals and humans, or relationships between different plants, and relationships change as things co-determine each other. And so when we're doing a diagram, we're drawing a diagram, what we're drawing is as it were, in some sense, definitions of those elements, as much as using pre-existing defined elements. The relationship is what matters in the diagram. So coming back to that, the relationship of resemblance, we can kind of understand as something looks like, seems like, appears like, something has a resemblance to. So we can look at that relationship in terms of the way in which we might talk about and think about resemblance in our everyday language, perhaps. In terms of disparity or difference, however, we're not using things that look like each other. Rather, what we're doing are encountering something more like variations, more like intensities. And so there can be disparities of temperature, in a sense, rather than resemblances of temperature, but they constitute, through their disparity, a kind of gradient or continuum, a kind of idea of temperature. And similarly, there can be, various intensities to go back to the idea of the righteous person, there can be various intensities of the righteous, such that a high intensity actually kind of maybe self-destructs and implodes, and so there's a kind of low intensity righteousness that may actually, be necessary to invert the relationship of the idea of righteousness into something, that's not like reactionary particularly, or something like that. There can be different kind of ways in which the idea is constructed when we think about the idea as constructed in varying intensities rather than resemblances. And this is one of the big shifts that Deleuze wants to bring in. And when we think of disparity, when we think of those relationships through disparity, through difference, relationships through difference, it seems peculiar because we seem to want to have like a pre-existing similarity, but which we have to avoid. There's no pre-existing similarity in these relationships of simulacrums, this relationship of disparity or difference. And so it's maybe useful to think about some synonyms for disparity: variation, contrast, gap, difference, divergent. These ways in which things are brought together through their divergence, through their difference, through the gap between them, through their contrast, through the variations. And so those things aren't, splitting off from a pre-existing original. Rather, those things are somehow constituting a general idea of, let's say, the righteous person through the different contrasts or the gaps between one and another, through the differences, the variations, the divergences. And so we don't need to either have or presuppose some pre-existing object. A spectrum, actually, just a spectrum. And that spectrum doesn't need to be presupposed. That model doesn't need to be presupposed as somehow having to exist in a transcendent realm, such that it can be copied by the appearances, such that appearances can appear like this thing in the transcendent realm. Rather, the spectrum is constituted by the variation. The idea is formed by difference. But when ideas are formed by difference, the objects become, in this situation, no longer copies, but simulacrum. So Deleuze's reading is not, and I ought to take a break. So let me take a break for a couple of minutes there, actually. So go and get yourself a cup of tea. I'm going to go and have a quick, a quick bio break, as we say in World of Warcraft. I'm going to go to the loo. So I'll see you in a couple of minutes. It's 1933 on mine, so 1935, whatever a couple of minutes is at your end. Okay, have a stretch, make sure you're awake. This is obviously, I don't know, maybe it's simple stuff, but I find this complicated stuff, and it can be Um, it can be useful. It becomes useful when you're trying to get out of holes, trying to get out of difficulties, particularly when you're, confronted with certain kind of ideas or ways in which people argue and all that sort of stuff. So these things can be useful, but they're quite difficult to get to grips with at first. But once we get the models going, I think we can begin to, as I say, see how things play out a bit. So this is the kind of point of what I'm talking about at the moment. The simulacrum is a kind of key term in Deleuze's reading of Plato, in that it changes all the relationships that we think we're reading in Plato. That's kind of the idea, but it doesn't get rid of the previous ones, and so it doesn't it doesn't destroy or just completely remove the previous kind of readings, that kind of classical reading of idea in essence, but it kind of changes it shifts things around. Now, as I say, whether that's a better understanding of the world or whether it's just best to read it as a reading of Plato, it's safer to read it as a reading of Plato and to try and read it like that as a scholar. You don't have to make too many claims about the word. I think it's I think Deleuze kind of thought of it as a better reading of the world, actually. I mean, I think that is my sense of how he writes about it. And what's important to note in that case is that by the time he's met up with Guattari and he's begun to work on what we call schizoanalysis in the 70s and 80s, he drops all this stuff about the simulacrum. And he actually kind of rejects it as something. I think the phrase is, it doesn't really interest me anymore. But it's at this point that when he's working on this notion of the simulacrum, it's the same kind of time that Derrida and Foucault and all these other people are kind of big. I mean, the same kind of time at which the work around language is very important in continental philosophy. And Deleuze is not part of continental philosophy, and so he's a kind of producing in this moment philosophically another route other than the ones we're constantly presented with in a kind of form inside philosophical teaching, which is another perhaps reason why I ended up studying Deleuze, because it gave me a different route out than some of the other stuff, a route I preferred. Anyway, so let's get back to this notion of the reversal of Platonism. This is the name that Deleuze gives to his own project, not rejection, reversal. So the reversal of Platonism. And let's think about that just in terms, let's say, of different starting points. And again, I'm trying to sort of activate or use this diagram that's in the background here that's just there. Fucking hell, backwards there. I'm trying to use these diagrams to enable us to think. So that in one sense, in version 1 we have one kind of starting point, and in version 2 maybe we have another kind of starting point, or we might call them, these starting points, basic principles of the model of models, if we or the model of ideas. And one, as I say, the starting point is resemblance, and the other starting point is difference or disparity, or perhaps I prefer variation at the moment. And maybe that's useful. Maybe thinking about why variation is easier to sort of get to there than difference or disparity. So one relationship is resemblance, and the other difference, disparity, or variation. And so I think I like that notion of variation because the relationships with the objects, the relationship of difference, the relationship of disparity, or let's say the relationship of variation, is experienced as our experience of the object. And so the object is experienced kind of, in a sense, as a variation. There isn't a kind of different object over here that then somehow we kind of attach into an idea and go, oh yeah, it's a variant of idea number 1. This is a variant 1.3. Actually, we encounter the relationship of variation is encountered as the object itself. And I often think of things like music or art here, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. And one of the reasons I think that this relationship of variance, this relationship of difference is encountered as it were, as the experience of the object itself, is because this enables us to get to grasp with why and how we encounter objects through feelings, through variations, intensities. and that's kind of what we're actually encountering is not a just a surface phenomenon. We're encountering the object in its variance as part of a much wider form, a much wider model in some sense, through those variant feelings, through the variation in intensity of feeling that we encounter in the objects. So I quite like talk of variation. We can get back to that at another point. Let's move to the last couple of bits of today's, when I want to talk a little bit more about simulacras themselves. So we're using this word. So the object within the relationship of difference or variation is a simulacrum. The object within the relationship of resemblance is a copy. And so we have copies and simulacrum. And in Plato, the simulacrum is negative, the copy is positive. In Deleuze, there is no copy, there's just simulacrum. And so the negatives and positives are kind of within the simulacrum, within that particular realm. And so simulacrums are in the world, and if we're going to think about that process of dialectic, the process of division and collection, and we're going to sort of make our dividings and collectings of the world on the basis of this reversed Platonism, on the basis of the relationship of variation or difference, then the objects in the world, the appearances of the simulacrum, as simulacrum, would actually be a good place to start. So we can one of the first things we can do is make a distinction, make a division. We can encounter simulacra that have negative connotations and simulacra that have positive connotations, or that at least, as I've put here, variations with positive connotations, or at least ambiguous. So for simulacra with negative connotations, the mere simulacrum, the not real, the thing that is a false pretender, there's a negative connotations, I take it. We can agree on that. And the reason they're negative is because it doesn't have a connection to reality, and it doesn't have a connection to the essence, the idea. And so these are, things that we encounter through things like alternative facts in the post-truth world, where everything's a simulacrum, everything's a simulation of a fact rather than an actual fact. And it's a simulation because it's not got a factual relationship to the world. It's not got a relationship somehow of correspondence, perhaps. And these mere simulacrum, the negative version of the simulacrum, produce effects, but they're not, as it were, the right effect. They're the wrong effect. So they produce the effect of the idea. They produce, let's say, a simulacrum of justice, produce the effect of the idea of justice. But actually, it's a dissimulation. It's a lie. So let's get down to it. The negative connotation of the simulacrum is that the simulacrum is the liar in front of us. And when we begin to look at where we encounter simulacrums in the world in terms of negative connotations, we encounter simulacra in the world when we encounter the liar. Or when, more specifically, when we post facto, in other words, after the event, when we realise we believed a lie. Okay, we were duped. So in the moment after having been duped, we realise that we were duped. It's at that moment that this object, the person, the liar, becomes the simulacrum. We realise what they were. They're just a simulacrum of something, the truth that they had told or whatever. And so this is one of the primary ways in which we encounter simulacrums in the world, through liars. Other ways, forgeries, fakes, but also tricks and illusions. And that might give some people a hint to some of the difficulties here. So these are the way in which we encounter simulacra in the world. These are all simulacra: liars, forgeries, fakes, tricks, illusions. These are all simulacrum. They are not what they appear to be, or they are some attempt to present themselves as something other. And this is the negative connotations. But there are positive connotations as well. And let's just be clear about, plays, yes, machinators. There are positive connotations. There are positive versions of the simulacra in the world that we also encounter in the world through the actor, the novelist, the artist. and also through the trickster. And I think this in particular, that last figure, the trickster illusionist rather than the trickster deceptionist, although there's always a kind of binding between. The sophist, in a sense, is beginning to reveal, Deleuze thinks, the kind of tricksterism at the heart, in a positive sense, at the heart of Plato's idea of a philosopher, and the way in which there has to be a kind of simulation involved in philosophy. But the important point there is the positive modes of the simulacrum, the positive connotations of the simulacrum, the actor, the novelist, the artist, these, and the trickster. These positive modes, these are fundamentally connected to a kind of dynamic that occurs, and we could trace. Deleuze thinks we can trace this whole long line of this kind of dynamic all the way back to the Greeks themselves, and then perhaps all the way back to Plato himself, if read differently. And this kind of tracks through the history of philosophy like some sort of golden thread. Maybe, I don't know. I just really couldn't tell you whether that's really the case or not. It's a lovely idea. I think it seems a bit too neat to me, but a bit too tied up. But that idea is something like the realization of the creative power of the simulacrum, the positive power of the simulacrum, and the realization of, when we say creative and positive, we're not just talking about like making new stuff in the world. The creation of transcendence. Let's be absolutely clear here. It's the creation of truth, the creation of reality, the creation of something transcendent to appearances, and the capacity of the actor, the capacity of the novelist or the artist to really create reality, transcendent truth. This is something affirmed in many ways through this kind of underlying thread that I think Deleuze thinks is there inside philosophy, which, as I say, it may or may not be. And so this is not in any sense unique. This is not a particularly, Deleuze is not suddenly coming up with a particularly unique reading of Plato in some ways. What he's doing is it's the form in which he's giving this reading that gives it this kind of interesting thread. But that different kind of relationships between the object and the idea, in the relation of resemblance, the relation of Plato's participative resemblance, where the object is just a copy of the model. The idea is always out of reach. The idea is always, in a sense, out of reach. Can't be got to. Whereas in the relation of difference or variation, the object is still there at the end, but transformed. And it's not that the idea is somehow out of reach and sort of truth is somehow in a transcendent realm, but the object has gone through a transformation, and truth is in the object. Truth is in that thing. And I think for the artists and for the people in that creative, they're bound to like that one a bit more, aren't they? I mean, I can't really imagine why you'd think what you're doing is just making, is just making something that's unreal. And so there's this tension between the different kind of productive moments as well. So that kind of productive moment inside philosophy is often rejected in a way in terms of the creative capacity, or the insightful capacity of the intellect. And so there is a bit of a kind of intellect artist, I think, distinction here, but it's a bit simplification, but there's definitely an element of that that's kicking around in the background. So if it appears a bit like that to you, don't be surprised. It is a little bit like that. Now, this relationship, when we encounter these different simulacrums in the world, we can encounter good ones, we can encounter ones with good connotations, and we can encounter those with positive connotations as well as negative. And it's at this point that we can come back to some of the relationships that we encountered in relationship to the divine in the Phaedrus a little bit. And we can draw some analogies perhaps here. So in the Phaedrus we have the analogy of love as a passion, We have the idea rather of love as a passion that's taken up by Plato, by Socrates in his response to Lysias, and we get this kind of distinction there between the bad mad lover or the good mad lover. But we've accepted that love is irrational. Where good here means something like in touch with the divine, a touch of transcendence. And so the good lover is also, because of love being irrational, because of the passion itself, they're still, irrational, just as irrational as the bad lover, but they're good because of this touch of the divine, or the touch of transcendence. And it's at this point we can kind of see what's, in a sense, what's at stake in the selective procedures of the dialectic that Plato is putting forward. He's trying to select the right thing from the wrong thing. He's trying to select the good from the bad. And there's a model by which he perceives some things to be good or bad, and this model fundamentally is to do with how much they resemble the form or the idea, how close they are. But there's and this is something Deleuze is reading in that shortish text. There's a kind of encounter with morality and with Christianity here. And so we can begin to think about two kinds of simulacrum, the demonic simulacrum or the divine simulacrum. And so we encounter kind of ways in which these are, they're no longer questions of knowledge. Ways in which these are questions of something like, I wouldn't say a theological, because they're not theological, but they're ways in which they're questions of spirit, if you like. They're questions of soul or spirit. They're not any longer questions simply of knowledge. And so distinguishing between the divine simulacrum and the demonic simulacrum becomes a real, it's a real problem, because there's a kind of difficulty at the heart of the divine itself, which enables it to be simulated by the demonic, and that kind of it can't resist or reject that. It has to kind of work hand in hand with that, and then this kind of continuous relationship, in the same way that the lover is mad, the lover is irrational, the lover is passionate. Whether that's a good or a bad passion, that's a different question. In the same sort of way that the divine is always kind of bound up with the demonic in that sense. And so this kind of simulacrum moment becomes, this choice, this selection becomes almost religious. What's important there is just to focus on it not being what we call epistemic. It's not just about what's right knowledge. It's about what's kind of a right way of thinking about the world around you, the right kind of, remember, judgment of character. That's what's crucial in this selection procedure. Now, for Plato, the link to the real, to the essence through the object, is blocked if there's a simulacrum. It's blocked. It's like the cuckoo in the nest. There's a kind of blockage when the simulacrum. So there's a kind of, prevention of access to truth. Whereas for Deleuze, the question is, what does the simulacrum do? In particular, if we take it to be something of the divine, so the actors, the artists, these are kind of divine simulacra. They're not just demonic, they're not just blockages, but what are they actually doing? And what's kind of crucial here is they're producing an effect. In order to be a simulacra, it has to produce the effect of looking like something, so it has to produce the effect of resemblance. And then, so Plato's resemblance relation does exist, but it's produced, Deleuze thinks, by a more fundamental kind of production, a more fundamental relationship. And the simulacrum produces an effect. It's that which produces effects in some sense, but the kind of effect that the simulacrum produces is it's the production of effect that's transcendent to the cause, and it doesn't immediately flow from the object. So the effect of the artwork it's not like materially connected somehow to the sounds of the music or to the colours used in the object. Although there are artists that do kind of play with that. I'm thinking of kind of noise music like Throbbing Gristle, or some of the colour field paintings that play with the way in which the transcendent, the kind of connection with the object is produced simply by the field of intensities in the object itself. But generally speaking, you can't track, or it's very difficult to track some sort of causal relationship between something like an artistic object and the effect it has. If you could track that as a causal effect, I'm sure some artists would be a lot happier and a lot richer. It's kind of one of the fundamentals of the artist practice is that they can't know what's going to work. They can kind of have a sense of it, and they can get better and better maybe at having a sense of it, but they can't be certain what's going to work. Whereas if you're a mechanic on a car, it's the other way around. You pretty much know what's going to work, and occasionally you might have this little bit at the edge that you need to sort of wiggle out, and there's an artistry to that in a sense. But there's a causal relation that's determining things, whereas in the work of the artist, obviously that causal relationship is much more problematic. And so the simulacrum is the production of an effect that's transcendent to the cause in that sense, without the production of a transcendent object. And this is what's crucial. So the artwork doesn't produce an effect that somehow produces an object over there. The effect is enough. Transcendence exists in the effect. You don't need a transcendent object to secure it or ground it. It doesn't need to be some, weird sign sitting somewhere in the universe that says I am the truth. That doesn't need that for truth to actually exist in as an effect of certain relationships and certain situations. And so there's no God needed in this particular sort of structure of the relationships of difference or variation, but there is still divinity, there is still truth, there is still this transcendent effect. And this is what Deleuze wants to kind of push back in the reversal of Platonism. This takes us back to the claims that he made about Platonism introducing a poisonous transcendence. And that poisonous transcendence is when transcendence produces transcendent objects. And in denying transcendent objects, like forms or ideas or God or, absolute truth that sits outside of everybody, in denying some sort of transcendent object, we're not denying transcendent effects. We're not denying transcendence itself. But that transcendent effect, we're also acknowledging, is not going to be eternal. That's one of the things that kind of slips back out, or it's going to be eternal in a very different way from the way in which Plato's objects are eternal. And so that immediately connects us with one of the underlying and most dominant themes of 20th century philosophy, which is, rather than notions of content or analytical, which is philosophy's encounter since Kant with time. And at this point, we're going to have to sort of, this is the end of the lecture for today, but at this point we're going to probably have to think a little bit about the way in which the idea, the simulacra and time begin to operate, and we'll look at that a little bit next week, the week after. We've got 4 sessions left of the course. Okay, thank you very much for everyone for tonight, for being around or whatever. That's great and lovely. And as I say, if you're in the Free University of Brighton, there will be a seminar that begins in about 5 minutes. Something like that. I will open the Zoom room up. The details are on River. That's if you're a member of the Free University of Brighton and are on River. If you're not, you have questions or you're curious about stuff, you are welcome to get in touch through Discord. And I've just starting to play World of Warcraft, so if you do follow my channels, then occasionally I'll be popping up playing World of Warcraft. I'm getting ready for a new expansion called Shadowlands, so I'm going to pop up playing that. So you're welcome to drop in and say hi, but obviously it won't be philosophy. Philosophy's on Mondays. Other days I might be just mucking about online. But as I say, you're more than welcome to drop by, but it won't be philosophy on those days, unless it specifically says in the tweet or title there might be something going on. But mainly I'll just be playing games. Right, anyway, thank you very much everyone, and I will catch you again next week maybe.